The opinions expressed in this show do not necessarily reflect the views of the Tampa Bay Arts and Education Network.
Welcome. Today's program is produced and brought to you by Florida Tiger Bay Club. Florida Tiger Bay Club is the association of Tiger Bay clubs across the state of Florida. Our mission is to leverage the capability of Tiger Bay clubs of producing statewide programs that help educate and inform members and the Florida community on matters of politics in a balanced, nonpartisan way. And now, our moderator for today's program, Yvonne Fry, President, Florida Tiger Bay Club.
Hello, and welcome to today's Florida Tiger Bay Club Forum, an insider's look at political parties in Florida, issues and strategies for 2022. This event is the result of a collaboration among Tiger Bay clubs across Florida. In 2020, a group of leaders from the local clubs recognized that we had the opportunity to share our individual goals to educate and engage citizens on pressing issues and political races affecting our communities around the entire state. Last fall, Tiger Bay Clubs of Florida re-energized an existing dormant statewide organization and began sharing programming with a series on the 2020 elections. Thank you to each of the clubs for their work to bring these programs to audiences across Florida and nationally. Today's forum continues our Florida Tiger Bay Club legacy of presenting topics of statewide interest with panelists of statewide significance. In an increasingly polarized atmosphere, as thousands of Floridians leave the traditional parties to choose no party affiliation status, and Democrats and Republicans battle amongst themselves for the hearts and minds as well as the votes of their own party members, we want to discuss the future of the two existing parties and the evolving political landscape as we approach the midterm elections next year. To help us navigate this interesting moment in Florida and American politics, we welcome a panel of three longtime Florida politicos. Former Congressman David Jolly, who left the Republican Party in 2018 and has been a vocal proponent of non-partisanship, as well as Steve Schale, a Democratic political strategist, and Frank Terraferma, Director of House Campaigns for the Republican Party of Florida. But before we begin, I want to recognize and thank our production partner, Tampa Bay Arts and Education Network, for their support. This event is being live streamed from Tampa on Facebook, TV, radio, and websites across the state as organized by our participating Tiger Bay clubs.
Today's program was made possible by our sponsors, the Center for Law and Social Justice at Bethune-Cookman University and Statecraft Digital. We at Florida Tiger Bay Club thank you for your support.
Thank you again to our sponsors and the collaborative clubs who have made this program possible today. Hello and welcome to all three of our guests. I want to outline our event structure and ask for each of your consideration of our time limits. We're going to begin with an opening question, which you'll have 3 minutes to answer. You'll have 2 minutes per answer on the subsequent questions as well. If an answer elicits the opportunity for a response from another panelist, you'll have the option of a 30-second rebuttal if you like. We want to get to as many questions from Tiger Bay members from around the state as possible and also want to give each of you equal time in the conversation. I have a clock on my screen. I'll let you know if you have gone over your time, so that time goes quickly. And again, thank you for your respect of this structure and our intentions for an informative, interesting, and educational program today. As I mentioned, in the Tiger Bay tradition, our questions come from members of our clubs. In this case, the Tiger Bay clubs from around the state that are presenting these forums submitted questions from their members, and our question coordinators, Tampa Tiger Bay Club board members John Godwin, a Democrat, Lee Lowry, an NPA, and I, a Republican, have prepared them for today to ensure equity amongst them. I'll open with the first question with a time limit of 3 minutes. To get us started, I want to ask, Florida politics are often the bellwether indicator for the rest of the nation. What's the most significant but maybe unnoticed trend or indicator here in our state that will have far-reaching impacts on the political scene? We'll start with you, Congressman.
Well, look, thank you, Yvonne. Thank you to everyone who's attending today. I think in some ways what we're seeing in Florida both reflects the national trend, but perhaps also leads it in some ways as a deeply purple state, fairly evenly divided by performance, if not by registration. I think what we're seeing in today's Florida Republican Party and today's Florida Democratic Party is having this confrontation with a bit of an identity. I won't call it crisis because electorally both parties are as strong as they've ever been, But I think there is a question for your kind of low to medium information political consumer. What is the identity of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party today? It's not unusual. We've seen it in past chapters, but we are coming off an era in Republican politics that was and still is heavily defined by Trumpism and by the elevation of a man kind of over platform and over ideology. The notion that the party itself didn't have a platform in the last election, but yet was very successful in states like Florida. So electorally very strong, but what is the identity? I think that's a national trend and a state trend as well. Democrats plays out a little bit more on the left-right ideological spectrum, or maybe left to center, is the path forward for Democrats in Florida and nationally. And more to the center, more to the left. How do they keep the coalition together like they successfully did in 18 and in 20? Again, electorally, they didn't suffer too much. But I think if you were to try to define the brand of Democrats today, you're going to get a different answer depending on which Democrat you ask. And so to speak then to the no party affiliate, of which I'm very proudly a member of that group, I think there is a group of voters across the country, and Florida is a perfect example, that are being left behind. And here's the most important premise to this. It's not because they're centrist. We too often assume that independents are centrist. That's not true. Independents can be anywhere on the left-right spectrum. Maybe they're in the middle, maybe they're in the left, maybe they're in the right. I find myself a centrist because I think on some issues, the best answer is on the left, and on some it's on the right, and some it's in the middle. And I want the ability to follow the data, follow the science behind policymaking, follow outcome-based metrics, and say, how do we solve problems in healthcare and guns and education and so forth? That defines a lot of independents. They just want the problems solved. And as the two parties wrestle with ideological identities, they're leaving behind a lot of NPAs who just want problems addressed. And they don't want to be a part of the fight that suggests my dogma is better than your dogma. They just want solutions. We're going to see that trend in 2022 in Florida, and I think it reflects a national trend as well.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Terraferma, you're up next with that question.
Well, thank you for hosting this panel today and for having me to be here on behalf of the Republican Party of Florida. So my pleasure to speak to you all. I think one of the things that we saw in the 2022 election that we're continuing to see moving forward is certainly it was a surprise trend. Is really that Florida has really moved very much in the direction of the Republican Party. I mean, if you look at the last since 2000, Republicans have dominated in statewide races to the tune of 27 election victories to 7 on behalf of the Democrats. So while the Democrats did have a couple of wins there under President Obama, we really saw Florida move much more to the right with President Trump in 2016 and particularly in 2020, and as well as with the election of Governor Ron DeSantis, which most political pundits did not see coming. So we certainly see Florida is on the Republican spectrum, and it's well poised to have a strong election in 2022. I think one of the things coming out of 2020 that we saw was that the coalition that the president built was quite tremendous, where we saw upticks in votes in African American communities. We saw a strong surge in Hispanic communities. And one of the most surprising things I think has really gone undetected in so far from the 2020 election is that Donald Trump actually did really well in a lot of traditionally Democratic Jewish constituencies in North Miami Beach, in Golden Beach, Hallandale Beach, Turnberry Isle. Those precincts actually voted for Donald Trump, and those are not precincts that we previously had done well in. So I do think that that to me is one of the biggest takeaways from the 2020 election and how that plays out going into 2022. I think it bodes well for the Republican Party.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Schale, last but not least on this first question.
Yeah, thanks for having me on as well. It's good to be here, and it's good to be here with some friends. Good to have my friend Frank back in Florida from his couple-year exile in Idaho. It's good to have you home, my friend. I mean that all sincerely. Yeah, I mean, I want to set a little bit of kind of history here. I think it's interesting if politics in America goes through phases, and we're in a really I use the word combustible, but kind of topsy-turvy kind of era in American politics. the last time we saw politics kind of this up and down, you got to go back to like the end of the 19th century. And it was, in an era when people were just, they were seeing the economy transfer from kind of an agrarian family-oriented economy to one where people moved into cities and families broke up and you had massive immigration. And you would see, sometimes 40, 50, 60, 70 seat changes in Congress cycle after cycle. We saw third parties rise and fall. We saw, just kind of a really interesting political era. And it didn't really end until sort of people became comfortable with the new way of making a living in those days. And I first of all, I think we're kind of in that now. I think we're seeing this change to sort of the next the post-industrial revolution, not just here, but all around the world. And I think our politics is going to be pretty unique for a little while here, at least until the next generation younger than me kind of becomes who's a little more accustomed to this modern economy. So I would just say, first of all, kind of buckle up. Florida tends to be reflective of where people come from. I used to think Florida was a microcosm of the country, and I don't really think that's apt. More I get older, I really think Florida is just reflective of the people that move here. 65% of people that live here weren't born here. 20% of people that live here weren't even born in the United States. But they all have an impact on our politics. And if you look around what happened around the country, you saw Donald Trump do better with non-college whites than he did even 4 years ago. You saw him do better with Hispanics, particularly Hispanics from Latin America specifically. Frank said he did a little better with African American voters. I think more with Caribbean voters than African American, but a little better with Black voters. You saw Joe Biden do better with college-educated voters and suburban voters. And I think when you look at the trends in Florida, that's kind of what played itself out. You saw, Biden do better in places like Pinellas and Sarasota and Tampa and those, kind of areas. And you saw Trump do better in the places where the populations he did well with elsewhere play itself out. I tend to not, listen, I'm a Jaguars fan, so I'm a realist. But I think we don't really know what the next 2, 4, 6, 8 years are going to look like. John Kerry lost Florida by 5.5 points in 2004, and Democrats won 3 of the next 6 statewide elections. And so much of this going forward is dependent upon how Joe Biden performs, what his approval rating is going into the next election. But I don't think we're going to see the end of Florida being a competitive state, not even a hyper-competitive state anytime soon.
Thank you, and appreciate the historical perspective on that. A lot of times we're so near to things, instead being able to step back and see how some of those transitions happen is very interesting. Our first member question is, what will be the big political issues for the 2022 election cycle? You've all touched on this a little bit, but let's dig a little bit deeper of what do you think drives decisions and momentum and engagement and so on. Steve, if you'll start on that one, if you would.
Yeah, I think, I'm definitely curious to see what David and Frank said. I think in some ways, what drives voters is kind of dependent upon where you fall in the world right now. I tend to think, again, historically, if you look back since 1992, the president in power has lost seats in the midterm in all but 2 election cycles. And in those cycles that the party in power lost seats, the average rating of the president was 42%. Twice in both 98 and 02, you saw the party in power gain seats in the midterm, in part because the president was able to use a defining moment, whether it was impeachment or 9/11, to kind of reset the national narrative. And so, I really think that kind of how Biden's able to perform coming out of this, whether people feel like that he's moved the ball forward in a meaningful way, the economy is doing better. They feel like he's getting things done in Washington. Was he able to use the moment to kind of redefine the politics? Is where we're going to be. And obviously I'm hopeful, he's my guy, that we're going to be in a good place. But, I just tend to think that, there's a lot to be read in historical tea leaves. And again, if his approval ratings in the mid 40s going into, 2022, it's not going to be a good year. And if he's seen pretty well, I think that'll be reflected in the midterms. And I think, the driving thing is going to be how people feel about the direction of the country coming out of COVID.
Thank you. Appreciate that perspective. Frank, what are your thoughts on 2022?
Yeah, well, thanks again. And to my friend Steve, certainly really glad to be back in Florida. I'd like to think about more recharging my battery than being in exile. So, but really glad to be back. Specific to 2022, as Steve pointed out, a really great statistic in the fact that the president's party is tended to lose in the first midterm election, and certainly, that is a strong historical trend that's out there. But that in and of itself does not determine elections, but it is something that weighs in. One thing about the 2022 election is that 2022 elections, politics are going to be local. And you're going to see, local candidates and state candidates and their messages and their campaigns are going to be much more important than in a national presidential election like we had in 2020. And I think that under Governor DeSantis, Florida is well poised to prosper throughout the rest of the next 2 years. And I think that the DeSantis approach to handling COVID was the right approach. And we're going to see that clearly. Well, we can't know for sure, what issues lie ahead because, things just change literally every day. We do know that the pandemic is certainly going to be one of the issues. And I think it's a strong issue that the governor has to run on. I mean, we see that, states, other big states that had much more heavy hands of government involved in their pandemic response. We've seen, very little difference in a lot of the outcomes. But what we do see in Florida is that we're well poised to really reopen fully. Well, we are open, but we're well poised to just really prosper. We have a 4.8% unemployment rate right now, which is, the best of all the big states, and it's certainly well within the top third within the country. So our unemployment is in a great spot. We're well poised to really prosper once we fully get this coronavirus pandemic in the back.
Thank you. And David, your thoughts on 2022?
Yeah, look, I think it's very simple. If we are faced with a national or international crisis, an economic crisis, that will frame 2022. Short of that, this will all be about the pandemic and economy and how the parties responded. And it's very simple. Democrats are going to run on a message around the COVID economy that they fought to save your life. And Republicans are going to run on a message that they fought to save your job. And that's going to be the contrast. And each of them will be able to speak to that with some conviction, but they'll be speaking to a constituency that's already prepped to hear that. But I think we're going to see that play out nationally. And I think what will be unique in Florida is that we do have 5 statewide races. Our governor is up for re-election, and our governor is kind of centered to that latter argument that he fought to save the economy. I think Democrats, and who knows how the MPAs fall, but they feel as though the governor ignored their true fear and concern over the economy, over the public health pandemic. And so while he was championing the economy, he's going to run on that. And Democrats are going to say, yeah, but he was leaving us behind on the pandemic. At the end of the day, the current trend for Ron DeSantis is a very encouraging one. But we'll see if that trend can continue all the way to 22, or if this narrative gets interrupted by other national or international events.
Thank you. Each of you mentioned the national political scene and its influence, certainly for our races here in the state of Florida. So our second question goes a little bit further with that. And this question is, Biden's American Rescue Plan is polling incredibly well, including with a sizable minority of Republicans. On top of that, the share of voters who say the country is on the right track is at levels not seen consistently in nearly 2 decades. The Democratic momentum seems set to flow into the 2022 cycle. How can the Republican Party make a compelling case to vote red amid these successes? Frank, we'll let you start with that one.
Yeah, well, I think, again, that almost sort of dovetails into the previous question that we just talked about, that, midterm elections, again, the party that's not in power has always tended to do extremely well. We saw disastrous results for the Democrats with the 2010 election, the first election of President Obama, as well as the 1994 election, the first president with Bill Clinton. But those things just don't happen by themselves. They happen because parties work and because parties register voters, get voters out get them out to the polls. And and having candidates that can carry a strong message, and we have such a candidate in our governor Ron DeSantis and in our U.S. Senator Marco Rubio and the rest of our Republican ticket. I think while the bill, the bill that that just passed on the COVID relief, the supposed COVID relief, we find out that that bill is really, loaded up beyond all belief, and that really was a reason why Republicans just could not get behind that bill. It was just unfocused, it was untargeted, it was over costly. And, ultimately, the American people will make those decisions. But we have also seen the Biden administration making many, many missteps already in just the first few months in office. Their policies, their actions at the border, the rescission of a lot of the Trump policies that dealt with the border have now created frankly, a crisis, a humanitarian crisis at the border that is solely at the doorstep of the Biden administration. We've also seen the Biden administration devastate a lot of families with the cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline. And again, so we're way early into this right now. The election's far off, and we need to really see what's going to come down the pike.
Yeah, we all wish we had that crystal ball, right? David, what are your thoughts on this with the trending that's happening with the Biden plans?
So I think Democrats are facing a pretty critical decision here, and they need to make a decision soon, which is, do you go big in these first 2 years with a bold agenda? And that means eliminating the filibuster and passing everything with 51 votes or 50 votes. And you do so because you might only have 2 years to do this, right? Frank's analogy back to the first 2 years of the Obama administration is correct. If Democrats don't go big, then what does that mean for their base going into 2022? Is their base still energized? Because at this rate, the trend is Republicans would take the House of Representatives back in Washington. And if that's the case, we're looking at pure gridlock. So look, I don't know which direction Democrats should go. I mean, I'm somebody, as I said at the outset, who believes in incrementalism and consensus-driven policy. You can make the argument that consensus-driven policy is completely broken in Washington and we're not going to see it. So just go big. And I'd leave it to Steve to suggest whether or not Democrats should go big. If they do, though, you've got to justify what will appear as a fairly progressive agenda to a country that typically performs 50-50. And I think that's the political calculus Democrats are facing right now.
Yeah, Steve, that's quite a setup.
Yeah, I mean, what I think my sense on this is this gridlock, I suspect, is incredibly frustrating to Joe Biden. I mean, this is a guy who spent his entire career trying to find coalitions to bring these together. I have felt, for a long time that if Mitch McConnell treated him in good faith, that we could have real bipartisan work. The problem is like we saw in the COVID Relief Act, there wasn't really an attempt at bipartisanship. There wasn't really an attempt at bipartisanship on the Recovery Act in 2009, which worked, or the Clinton Economic Recovery Plan in 93, which worked. So I think, listen, Joe Biden's waited his whole life to be president. I think he is going to make an effort to have a conversation with folks to find common ground if it's possible. But if not, I suspect he's going to try to get things done. And, again, I feel pretty comfortable with the poll numbers on the COVID Relief Act that came out of here. People believe we should give money to folks who are struggling right now. They believe we should invest in infrastructure. They believe we should expand healthcare. These are not wild progressive ideas. These are pretty mainstream in American politics right now. And so we'll see going forward. I don't have a crystal ball. Again, I suspect that whether it's on, the Voting Rights Act that's under consideration or infrastructure, he would much rather do this in a bipartisan way. But I don't think he's not going to do anything if he doesn't have bipartisan dancing partners.
Thank you. Thank you to each of you for your thoughts on that. We've been talking national. Let's bring it a little bit closer to home here. Question number 3. The actions in the Florida House and Senate arguably have a more direct impact on Floridians than the actions of just about any other body. In the House and Senate, we routinely see the Republican Party advancing policies that create a larger and more centralized government as they continuously preempt local governments. Should we expect the brand of the Republican Party of Florida to shift to reflect to what appears to be their increasingly big government tendencies? David, I'm going to let you start with that one.
Yeah, I love this conversation because it's one of the major characteristics of the Florida Republican Party that I no longer recognize. But I wouldn't say that big government, the way we traditionally think of it is, but it is centralized government in Tallahassee, which is anathema to the Republican Party I used to belong to. You know, the Republican Party of Florida used to be about local control, and now it only permits local control by Republicans. And if there are Democratic policies that confront the policies of Republicans in Tallahassee, they quash it, and they reach for a higher theory, right, around personal freedom or personal liberty. But you can look at environmental decisions of the last 2 years, but go straight to COVID and local communities that wanted to either enforce mask mandates or they wanted to shut down in-person teaching and go to virtual classrooms. The old Republican Party would have trusted decisions that were made by local leaders in their local communities. This Republican Party doesn't. And so I find myself in agreement with the questioner. I know my Republican friends have all these arguments about how local Democrats overreach, but look, we either trust local elected officials and the government closest to the people or we don't. I think this is a trend we've seen now for 20 years in today's Republican Party, but the local control argument, the local control issue itself reached a breaking point where I don't think Republicans can speak with any credibility about trusting local government anymore.
Thank you. Steve, I'm going to let you go next, and we'll let Frank respond to both of y'all, if that's all right. Let's go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I grew up in the Republican era of less government and more personal responsibility. And, you know, I think that seems like we've moved away from that, whether it's people taking personal responsibility for their own health during the pandemic or less government in general. And now, listen, I think that in some of these questions, there's a perfectly reasonable argument around some of these preemptions, some of these larger issues that, you know, require, you know, whether it's distributing state infrastructure or making sure that there's sort of rational plans in the way the economy functions. I mean, I understand that Florida's a big, complicated state, and if you have 426 different versions of something, you can have a problem. But, you know, I certainly do sort of giggle, and I've certainly given my Republican friends, you know, a joust here or there for the fact that, you know, there are things we're regulating that's going to make California look like a free market state before long. And so just kind of the world we're in right now, you know, and Frank laughs, but it's actually true, you know, you know, not on everything, but in some things, you know, some of these data issues, for example, again, make California look like it's, you know, a free market state. But, you know, they're in charge until the voters say they want to do something different. It's going to be the way it is, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Frank, how would you respond to the question and to your fellow panelists on this one?
Yeah, so great question. And I strongly disagree with the premise of the question. I mean, clearly the Republican Party has had a really strong common sense conservative approach to state government. I do find myself agreeing quite a bit with what Steve Schale said, that there are certain issues that you can't have, you know, two cities within the same county having two different takes on a problem. So yes, of course, there are times when we are going to see our state government legislate in certain areas, but it's often because, you know, you have to have a unified state policy, whether it's having, you know, getting our students back into the classrooms. I mean, and there's a myriad of other issues, but the Republican Party has been, you know, has held the legislature since 1996, and they have a proud record of really keeping government in check. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that, you know, that the taxes would be much higher if the Democrats had, you know, had continued to hold on to the Florida legislature. And you know, I just feel like our record is really strong when it comes to lower government and less taxes. So I just have to really strongly disagree there.
Thank you. Any response from either of the other two panelists here?
Yeah, can I just kind of push the theory of the case here with Frank for the sake of conversation? I think it's hard to suggest that we need a statewide policy to stick with education, when one of the fundamental premises of Republican ideology that I'm familiar with is that the situation in Miami-Dade public health was very different than in a rural county in the Panhandle. And you could have made the argument for keeping in-person teaching in a low pandemic county while shutting it down in a high pandemic study. And I think high pandemic jurisdiction, that's traditional Republican, let local communities make the decisions. And I guess where I would also test the credibility of Florida Republicans, I'm not drawing you into this, Frank, personally, but the long-term narrative of the Republican Party of Florida is if the case was reversed and if a Democratic governor had shut everything down, Republicans would be yelling right now that the local community in the Panhandle with a low pandemic rate knows best, and let at least them open under the theory of local control while South Florida stays closed. I just don't think there's a credible narrative for Republicans around this issue of local control if you go back through the modern history of the Florida Republican Party.
Thank you. Frank, last word.
Yeah, I feel like Governor DeSantis had the right approach, that he, had the right approach and throughout the pandemic. You have a certain amount of flexibility there, whereas also to have a few key premises and knowing the whole broad picture of the state of Florida, and has really had the right hand. And, our Florida legislature has done a strong job in legislating in terms of having a conservative, common sense approach. Oftentimes we do have to remember that we do need to give people, more freedom. And I just think we have a terrific record.
Okay, thank you. Steve, we're going to get you first on the next question, if that's okay. If you look at the makeup of our panel, traditionally, if you were to talk about the major issues around Florida politics, we'd line up and invite a guest from the Republican and Democratic Party. But today, I think really reflects the significance of the growing third party of how we've done this, which leads us into our fourth question from our members across the state. And that is that there are a lot of conversations right now about the role of NPAs in Florida's elections. Last election cycle, there was an amendment on the ballot to change our primaries to be more open. It received a support of a majority of Floridians, but not the necessary 60%. Then following the January 6th siege on the Capitol, a record number of Floridians switched their registrations to NPA. Could there be room in 2022 in Florida for a successful statewide NPA candidate? And Steve, if you'll start with that one for us.
Yeah, certainly. I want to just real quick address the last question. I want to give an example.
Okay.
I think
Sure.
that an example of a mayor who did something different than her party did very well is Lenny Curry, Republican in Jacksonville, who enforced the mask mandate, for example, and has found ways to expand vaccine and testing. And so I do think there are examples, just not on the left or right traditional spectrum, where you saw mayors do things differently and do really well. I think on this third party question, generally, I think David and Frank know very well, an NPA doesn't mean you're an independent. If you're a young Latina independent voter in Orlando, you're probably pretty liberal. You probably vote fairly Democratic. If you're an NPA white guy in North Florida, you probably think the Republicans are a little weak-kneed on some things. And so, most independent voters have a preference. And so I think that this idea that you've got this big chunk of people that are non-party affiliate, you're seeing every organization is struggling with membership, traditional organization, because people just aren't associating in the way they did 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so I think part of this is just kind of a cultural phenomena with how people sort of organize themselves. I do think, I suspect David's going to disagree with me. I do think it's a really hard row to hoe if you're an independent trying to run statewide. And I just think it's because partisanship is such a strong definer of how people vote. That in order to win, as an NPA statewide, even at the bare minimum, you're probably going to have to convince 35-40% of people who register and identify as a political party to leave that identification and to vote for somebody different. And again, I actually, as a Democrat, think that we should have a system that was more open. I think that we need more voices in it. I think that open primaries would have led to more diverse ideologically and racially, ethnically primaries. I think that had been a good thing. I'm a moderate. I think that the more voices lead to moderation, but I think it's pretty hard to see in the current political environment sort of room for a truly viable third party in Florida. Because again, most NPAs already have a view.
Yeah, thank you. Frank, what are your thoughts on the viability of an NPA running statewide?
Yeah, I definitely agree with my good friend Steve here on a few of his points, and certainly disagree with him on a couple. But it is a tough road to hoe for an independent candidate to run successfully. With being a part of a party, you have a network of folks, a network of workers out there on your behalf when you are the Republican nominee or the Democrat nominee, and an independent just simply doesn't have that. I do feel like that their voters do have a distinction. They do understand there's a large distinction between Republicans and Democrats. So it's hard for them to judge an independent candidate, and so those are all very significant factors that an independent candidate would have to to deal with. Specific to the amendment that was on the ballot, I mean, the Republican Party, officially opposed that, as well as the Democratic Party officially opposed that, and even groups such as the Black Caucus also opposed that idea of having a quote jungle primary. And I think that certainly would have unintended consequences, where you could end up having a general election with 2 Democrats or a general election with 2 Republicans. That is not what people would expect. So I feel that the way the parties can best be out there for the voters is to have a contest with a Democrat and a Republican in a general election, and I think has been the best way to go in the past, and I think it's certainly the best way to go in the future.
Thank you. David, I would assume that this question might be more personal to you than even to these other folks. What would you like to share with our audience today?
Yeah, as someone currently considering running for governor in 22 as an independent, I actually agree with Frank and Steve. It's an incredibly daunting task, and I would agree it's very hard, and it may not be viable. They're exactly right. But I disagree a little bit if you look at the numbers. We know about 1/3 of the state, when we register, chooses no party affiliation. We self-sort 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, but on the first Tuesday in November, we perform 50-50. And so the question is why? And I think under today's election system, it's because on election day, we don't see choices in equity between R, D, and I. When you register to vote, it's a generic affiliation, and our choices in equity are 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But because we consume our politics, much like other things in life, by brand, right? We're conditioned to the R&D brand. We need an independent to have the money and the infrastructure to create the viability and be seen on par with the R&Ds. I would say, going to the question about primaries, election reform is a very close brethren of the independent political movement. The idea is, let's create a level playing field where the most number of candidates, ideas, and most number of voters can participate. And look, you can make the case for closed primaries, but I would suggest if the Republicans and Democrats want closed primaries, then they should pay for them. Either have a convention in Orlando if it's strictly a party activity, or you pay the 67 supervisors of election to run your closed primary election activities. Why should taxpayers support a partisan activity? I like the reforms we've seen in Alaska right now, which is every candidate appears on the same primary ballot. Every Alaskan voter gets to vote. The top 4 move to November, and in November, it's a ranked choice voting system. What it allows is the greatest amount of consensus around the winning candidate to emerge. It also forces candidates to think about more than just their partisan voters, right? How can I represent the greatest number of voices in the state of Florida? Because in an election system with a level playing field, that's the type of candidate and performance behavior we'll see. This notion that somehow to participate in politics, we must be forced into an association with one major party or the other, to me just seems anathema to the gig economy we're in, where we get choices. The whole idea of today's economy is we get choices, any type of brand, any type of product. But in politics, we're tethered to the politics and the associations of 100 years ago. I don't think it makes any sense. It doesn't for me. I feel like I wasted the first 20 years of my political career with a party that took a direction that didn't make sense to me. And I didn't want to get tethered along with it. But I can't find a home in the other one as well. And I think a lot of Floridians are in exactly that spot today, and they're looking for an alternative.
Thank you. I was going to, Steve, I'll let you respond, but I was going to say, in the spirit of collegiality that we have today, if either one of y'all have any words of advice for David as he's considering this.
Wait, let me
Steve,
guess. Frank's going to say do it, and Steve's going to say don't do it.
Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Well, so I was going to say, I think there's lots of ways to approach reforming the election. I mean, there are a lot of really legitimate arguments against the open primary. Some for people that are not just from the partisans, and there are concerns that you could also you could block out communities of color in some ways by the way these ballots were designed. So I mean, I think there's a lot of there. I would not have gone that direction. But I do think that, you take a state like South Carolina, one of the great untold stories of how Joe Biden won the South Carolina primary by such huge numbers was not just African-American turnout in Jim Clyburn. it was white suburban women who were Republicans who chose to vote in the Democratic primary for Joe Biden. And I think, there are a number of states where voters can walk into the polls, they can choose a primary ballot, and they can vote. And again, I think that may be a middle ground. I do think in the end, the more competition we have in our elections, just like anything in the market, competition makes things better. What we know is that the current system, frankly, encourages people to run to the extremes of their parties and primaries. And I just don't think that's a healthy thing for democracy. So with that, listen, man, David, I mean, you're a friend, and I'm not going to, I don't tell people to run or not. I actually tell folks all the time, if you're going to wake up the morning after qualifying and regret it, you should always run. It's a hard road to hoe. And I think that. And listen, I open this door to everybody thinking about running for office, Republican or Democrat. I'm always happy to help them think through their process.
Thank you. Frank, you have a word of advice there?
I think I would prefer not to offer advice to another candidate.
Okay. All right. You had your shot at that one.
Yvonne, if I could add something in the spirit of kind of this conversation, I think it is true of independent politics nationally in the state of Florida. You need the moment to meet you halfway. And, you saw the moment meet Ross Perot halfway in 92, but it didn't meet Howard Schultz halfway in 2020. The dynamics always different. But we are living in a cycle that is just crazy in terms of the dynamics. And so I had a colleague say to me in October, November, when I talked about running as an independent, they said, yeah, but the viability challenge, what could possibly change in the next 2 years to disrupt that? And I said, I don't know. Then January 6th happened. And the independent movement kind of exploded after January 6th. Now, certainly that's not enough to carry an independent candidacy through November, but in this cycle, in today's politics, who knows what happens between now and qualifying early next summer?
Yeah, lot to see how it all plays out for sure. I appreciate y'all being good sports on that question. Our next one, Frank, I'm going to start with you on this. Question number 5, how can Republicans keep the voters energized by Trump, engaged while not alienating the suburban voters who have found him repulsive? So that's quite a blunt question. We'll let you start with that one.
Yeah, I certainly, would suggest that, repulsive is a pretty strong word. And I don't think that that's, really what the situation is. I mean, certainly we have seen that, parties, they tend to, they tend to change over time. And we are seeing some demographic changes. But if anything, the demographic changes that we're seeing within the Republican Party are actually making it bigger and not actually making it smaller. So whereas we may have seen, changes on one side, we've also seen the president's coalition grow. And, he certainly did a tremendously better job in ethnic communities, in working class communities. So, realistically, the Republican Party is well poised to do really well in 2022 with Governor DeSantis and our Republican ticket.
Steve?
I would just offer this thought. First of all, I sat through a lot of focus groups, and suburban women used very strong words to describe Trump, But that being said, I think that one of the mistakes that people in my party made was assuming that the Obama coalition transferred to anybody else. And we learned in very hard and real ways in both 2010 and 2014 that it didn't. In the same way that Trump learned in 2018, Republicans learned in 2018, the Trump coalition, while DeSantis won, generally did not transition to Republicans. And I think that, getting back to for my party to win Florida, obviously we've got to fix the issues we've got with Hispanics that I don't know if they're one cycle or not. Just being perfectly honest, but we need to fix those. We need to get back to the building blocks of registering voters. And listen, Frank Terraferma is the smartest guy on their side, and I'd say that in public and private to anybody who will listen. He's been a friend and an adversary and a sparring partner for my entire career. And I also know that they're not going to take anything for granted and run on Trump coattails. They're going to recruit good candidates and run good races.
Thank you. Tremendous respect here, and certainly it's more complicated than just as simple as that question might seem. David, you have some closing comments on this question?
And no, I think the trend is the Republicans' friend. I think DeSantis and Republicans are favored going into 22. I think this conversation reflects an open question, though. What is the involvement of Donald Trump and Trumpism in that race? And is that the Republican brand, or are they able to take the parts of Trump they like and get away from the parts they don't? And I think for Democrats or an independent candidate or anybody, look, I don't think Democrats haven't won the governor's mansion in 28 years, and I'm not optimistic they can do it this next cycle. I think the successful candidate, whether Democrat or independent, but let's just say it's a two-party race with a Democrat and Republican, you've got to change the narrative to something that is as compelling to Floridians as anything else that DeSantis will be arguing about. You don't want to argue about Florida's economy with DeSantis. He has a good record to run on. But what about education? Why doesn't Florida have the top education system in the entire country, if not the world? The opportunity to change a life for a student happens every day when they walk through the public school system. So why have we abandoned our public schools, but also embraced some of the Republican solutions like choice? There's an opportunity to completely transform Florida's education system, make it the best in the country. If you can frame the race next November around an issue in which the governor doesn't naturally have a strength, you could redefine it and possibly have a shot at beating him. But if this is a race on Ron DeSantis' performance on the economy, he wins in November of 22.
Thank you. Frank, any comment, response to that, or you want to keep moving?
Yeah, I mean, I would just come to the point where, as Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. And I do agree with David that the economy is a strong suit for the governor, and that's typically the most important issue for people when they go to the polls. And so I feel really good about our chances in 2022.
Thank you. Our next question leads just right in from the conversation we just had. And for the 2022 campaign, will we get the DeSantis who reads to his children about Trump's border wall, or the DeSantis who aims to strike bipartisan tones on things like the environment? Frank, will you help us understand that one first?
Yeah, definitely. And, I think the governor has a great record, and whether it's on the environment or on the economy. So, every candidate's going to have a broad-based platform. They're not going to just run on only one issue, but the governor's done a lot of good on the environment and great on the economy. He's done a terrific job on protecting seniors. I mean, Florida's the second oldest state in the country per capita. And, he's done a tremendous job on, again, protecting seniors in this pandemic. I think Florida's record on education is a good record in improving our schools and in bringing choice into the equation. So the governor has done a great job. Our Republican legislature is there backing up our governor. And, I think we have to work hard because we can't take anything for granted. But, if we take a look at 2022 election, we see 2020 election, we saw Republicans have a higher turnout within the Republican Party than the Democrats, or certainly than the independents. And that's in a presidential year. In an off year, the turnout even favors the Republicans, just tend to vote more in an off year. So, we just have a lot of good things going for us, from our candidates to our record to our voters.
Thank you. David, what do you think are the issues that come forward as what defines the voter engagement?
Look, I don't know what the governor will run on, but there's not a credible platform for him to run on bipartisanship. And I would say, I think Frank framed the issues that you will hear from the governor and Republicans, and you'll hear a contrasting message from Democrats saying that's all wrong. And at the end of the day, there'll be some truth that both parties are pushing forward, and there'll be a lot of false narratives that both parties are putting forward. And I think that's where, when I talked about the independent voter at the beginning, there's a mistake to suggest that the independent voter in Florida who will sway this election is necessarily centrist. The independent voter is not monolithic. I think Steve referred to that. Some independent voters are progressive, some are conservative, some are centrist. But the bulk of those voters who have rejected the two parties and will call BS on the two parties narrative going into the 22 race, it's because they just want a state that excels in education and healthcare and the economy. Don't cherry pick the stats that look best for your party and cherry pick the stats that look worse for the other party. We see through that. Recognize that not every solution is going to always end up on the right or always end up on the left or has to be in the middle. That's not true. Some of the best solutions we have today are all over that spectrum. So don't feed us the garbage that somehow only your party has the answers. The party that can address that frustration, that voter, you'll create a governing majority in the state of Florida for the next generation that doesn't require gerrymandering the Florida House and Florida Senate to keep it.
Thank you. And Steve, if we turn this question around, what is the counter message that can be successful for Democrats this year?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I just think there's an eternity to go. I mean, the Jaguars haven't drafted Trevor Lawrence and won a Super Bowl yet before we get to the Super Bowl, before we get to the next election. So we got a long ways to go here. Had to get my Trevor reference in here. Yeah, I mean, listen, I think we need to be more aspirational. I think one of my frustrations with my party is, and I think one of the things that both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama did really well, and part of why they did very well, not only with communities of color, but with working class white voters as well, or retired labor voters, et cetera, was that they painted a vision of what America can be. And I think, if you're on my side, whether you're Nikki or you're Charlie or you're Anna, or you're somebody else thinking about running at this point, Annette, I have the challenge that I'm going to have a lot of friends in this race, and I'm probably going to go to Frank's place in Idaho for 2 years. But I think we need to paint a picture of what Florida can be. And I think David said, I think Florida's a great place. I love this state immensely. I don't agree with everything Ron DeSantis does and doesn't do, but I love this state. But I also think there are a lot of things. I think Florida can be the beacon of the southern part of the United States into Latin America in the way that Hong Kong is in Asia, or Singapore is, or London is into Europe. And I think that's what we need to be striving for. And I think we need to do a better job of painting a picture of how investing in schools, how leaning into infrastructure can really improve the lives of people in the state. And again, I just think that, we tend to not do that really well. But again, I think that's what Barack Obama was able to do. And again, I think that generally that's be my advice to anybody who's running, paint a picture of a state that moves beyond just kind of the incremental politics. I hate that word, but like just kind of moves beyond the cycle to cycle politics, but really does have a long-term vision for a better place.
Thank you. I'm going to try and get through about 3 more questions. So if we can narrow down to about 45 to 60 seconds on each response, we'll keep moving. We want to hear from as many of our members as possible. The next question is, the 2022 gubernatorial campaign seems to be getting significantly more attention than the 2022 Senate campaign. Are we to conclude that Marco Rubio's seat is a lot safer than Ron DeSantis's? David, would you start with that one?
Yes, it is.
There you go. We'll keep moving. Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think there are 2 reasons why. First of all, I think Marco's a tough win. I'm not going to lie about that. The other thing is, listen, I've never met anybody who's been in both the Senate and been a governor who didn't like being governor more. I just think it's a more attractive job, and so I think A, part of it's elections, and B, it's like, if you want to make real change in America right now, why would you go to Washington? And so I think a lot of folks are just looking at at Tallahassee, a place where they can make a real difference.
Thank you. And Frank, last word on this one.
Yeah, I think, the governor's office is certainly gaining more attention than the Senate race at this point. But I think by the time we get to November, next November, both races will probably be, a pretty big focus. We'll see the airwaves really light up in both contests. But I think because of coronavirus and because of the role that the governors have taken, naturally taken in this pandemic, that I think that's a little bit more why the focus we're seeing there on the governorships.
Yvonne, if I could add one thing, Yvonne,
Sure.
The governor's race is going to get so much more attention is, should Ron DeSantis be reelected, he is the front runner for the Republican nomination for the White House, and I believe could beat Joe Biden in that race as well. You may see a reelected Ron DeSantis. He's going to have to face the question on the trail, will he serve 2 years or 4? But he is the front runner for the White House if he gets reelected here in 2 years in Florida.
Yes, important to note on that. Thank you for adding that in. One more question from a member. What does an ideal statewide candidate for the state of Florida look like? What characteristics, values, and skills would they have? And is such a person among the current and rumored gubernatorial and Senate candidates. So follow up from that last question. Frank, would you start with that one?
Yeah, I think a requirement to be a successful candidate is someone who can really connect with the people. To have that charisma, to have that energy, to go out there and connect with the voters, and to share the same ideas that the majority of the voters share. So I think I think we have that. We saw that with Governor DeSantis, with Senator Rubio, that they connect and they reflect the voters of Florida. So I think that really that it just boils down to that.
Okay, Steve, what's your ideal candidate look like, and is there a person that personifies that?
I mean, I don't know if there is or not. I mean, these things are always easier in reality than they're not. But I mean, give me somebody who has a clear focus for why they're running, has a vision for Florida, and the ability to go raise $100 million, and we'll have a conversation.
There you go. That's easy, isn't it? So, David, how easy is that?
Raising $100 million is impossible. No, look, you could also say it's the candidate that can speak about free markets and free communities in Spanish in South Florida, can make their way around a cattle farm and citrus grove, can grab a surfboard in Cocoa Beach and open the Bible in the Panhandle and read with authenticity, right? I mean, Florida is a state that we have a rich culture, we have a rich community, we are diverse. Within the state, we are diverse through our cultures. But, at the end of the day, I think you're seeing Democrats try to figure out this, who can win the state of Florida. I think the challenge for Democrats is to accept what Republicans figured out, which is Florida is very much a free market state rooted in liberty. It's almost this libertarian right of center state that has emerged. And there's a reason people come to Florida every day. It's because of that. Now, it gets a little Wild West at times because of lack of regulation, because of lack of statutory authority. And you can also say that some parts of our quality of life are left behind, right? I've spoken about education. I think it's ridiculous that Florida is not the leading education center in the entire country. So you can make the case, if you're a Democrat, that there are areas that have been left behind. But if you're a Democrat, you've got to take the lessons of success from Republicans. Florida's a free market, individual liberty-driven state. And so as we adjust communities that have suffered a disparate impact from that platform, keep in mind that to win the whole state, you've got to accommodate government solutions that also fit within the framework that represents the majority of the state.
Thank you. Got one last question. And again, we are short on time, so appreciate your brevity in this. But given what we all experienced in 2020, it was a tough year. And so I'm looking for some positivity, maybe even some ideas for collaborative action here. What are you most optimistic about in Florida politics in 2021? Frank, would you start with that one for us?
Yeah, the thing I'm the most optimistic about is the coronavirus being in the rearview mirror. In fact, I just got my shot today, and Florida and the nation has suffered a lot, and look forward to having a normal life back.
Thank you. Agreed. David, what about you?
Look, I think politically participation remains at an all-time high, and that's good. We're still falling far short of where we need to be, but the more interest by more Floridians in politics is important. The challenge is we're participating in a winner-take-all election where one party wins with 51% of the vote and then makes all the decisions and doesn't worry about the other 49, which leads then to this restless base that is intrigued by election reforms, like we saw in open primaries 2 years ago. We saw in gerrymandering reform before that. I think the restless, high participation NPA voting base in Florida that continues to grow is a good thing for our politics. I don't know that this is the cycle that it turns the corner, but the acceleration within that lane, I think, is very important.
Thank you. And Steve, last word from you. Give us something positive to head on out with. You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm ready for 2021. I lost 5 friends in 2020 to this virus, and I haven't seen my grandmother or my nieces and nephews in 15 months, and I'm ready for it to be over like everybody. I do think you've seen some things in the last few weeks that are very optimistic. I thought that Mayor Curry and Vice President Harris coming together around vaccines in Jacksonville was fantastic. I think you saw bipartisanship in the House around expanding healthcare for women who just had a child. It was very optimistic. I think that the federal funding may give us an opportunity to have some real bipartisan conversations around infrastructure going forward, which is exciting. And more than anything, I'm just looking forward to getting my shot so I can have lunch with my friend Frank Terraferma, who it's been way too long since I've seen.
Great. Thank you, each of you, to our guests who spent this time with us to answer the tough questions from Tiger Bay Club members from around the state. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us. We hope you'll follow us on Facebook at Florida Tiger Bay Club so you can stay up to date on our programming schedule. And again, thank you to our guests.
Today's program was made possible by our sponsors, the Center for Law and Social Justice at Bethune-Cookman University and Statecraft Digital. We at Florida Tiger Bay Club thank you for your support. Today's program was produced and brought to you by Florida Tiger Bay Club. Florida Tiger Bay Club is the association of Tiger Bay clubs across the state of Florida. Thank you for joining us today.